morning, you're watching Daybreak live on A News, and I'm here to take you through the day's top stories. So let's take a look at the leading headlines. US and Iran are in indirect talks to extend 2-week ceasefire due to end on the 22nd of April. Pope Leo visits Cameroon with a message of peace in the middle of attacks from Trump. And 9 are killed in a second Turkish school shooting just in 2 days. First this morning, the United States is increasing pressure on Iran as efforts to end the conflict continue, with new developments emerging on both the military and diplomatic fronts. We now head first to our A News correspondent in Washington, U.S Iran, who has more.
According to a new report in Washington on Wednesday, at a private White House dinner, President Trump told the visiting Dutch king and queen that he wants to end the Iran war quickly, saying that the only way to bring Tehran back to the negotiations is to, quote, increase the pressure. And U.S. Military Central Command has announced that an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel attempted to evade the U.S. blockade after leaving the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas, exiting the Strait of Hormuz, and transiting along the Iranian coastline. An American guided missile destroyer, according to U.S. military officials, interdicted the vessel and successfully forced it back to an Iranian port. U.S. military officials say that 10 vessels have now been turned around and that 0 ships have broken through since the start of the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports came to effect on Monday. Trump administration officials believe that the blockade of Iranian ports will prove immensely costly for the Iranian economy, which could lose hundreds of millions of dollars in lost energy export revenue per day. The White House has signaled behind the scenes that President Trump wants to see the end of hostilities between Israel and Lebanon, where clashes between Israeli forces and Iranian-backed Hezbollah continue. While the U.S.-Iranian negotiations are technically separate from the Israeli-Lebanon talks, officials in Washington believe that an end to the fighting in Lebanon could help in efforts to reach a deal with Iran. And while the Iranian ceasefire continues to hang in the balance, there are growing signs that the Trump administration may be preparing for an operation against the island of Cuba. New reports in the U.S. press say that the Pentagon is quietly stepping up contingency planning for a possible military operation in Cuba, per orders from President Trump, but nothing has been ordered just yet. President Trump has on a number of occasions publicly said that an operation against Cuba may be the next step once the Iran war is completely resolved. I'm U.S Iran, A News, Washington.
Now let's take a look at the stories shaping the day across the globe, and we head first to the Guardian website and Sudan. And there was more than $1 billion pledged for Sudan as humanitarian crisis deepens. Now there was a meeting in Brussels, there was in Berlin yesterday, and they were able to actually go further than their target in relation to what is going on there. There's been a 3-year conflict in the country of Sudan, where United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says this nightmare must end, and the humanitarian crisis is worsening and worsening. Now, the financial commitments will also help to offset a chronic humanitarian funding shortfall, which has impacted those who have been displaced. Now, we know that 2/3 of Sudan's population, which is roughly 34 million people, require assistance and have actually fled due to the conflict there. However, the prospect of peace still remains as distant in this whole thing, only because there's been little progress on ceasefire talks, but neither of Sudan's warring parties, which is the Parliamentary Rapid Support Forces, which is known as the RSF, and the army traveled to Berlin to about the funding that was raised. Now, Sudan's army-aligned foreign ministry has actually denounced delegates for not consulting it and accusing Western countries of colonial tutelage approach in relation to what is going on there. Now, outside of Germany's foreign ministry, hundreds of protesters were assembled, many chanting against the United Arab Emirates and its alleged support for the RSF. There has been certain controversial reports and comments to state that the UAE is involved in funding the RSF in regards to the conflict in Sudan, and they are not being reprimanded or investigated about that. But this money, this over $1 billion support in humanitarian aid, will definitely help those directly in need and who have been displaced by this conflict. Okay, now let's turn to the next story, and that's in regards to our first story this morning with Iran. And the New York Times is leading on that. It says Pakistani mediators arrive in Iran to keep peace talks alive. So senior Pakistani mediator arrived in Tehran on Wednesday for talks aimed at bringing together, assuring a ceasefire between Iran and the US before it expires next week. Now, Iran has continued to exchange messages through the US, through Pakistan, since initial talks ended without an agreement on Sunday, and the two sides have yet to agree to another round. However, White House press secretary expressed optimism about the negotiations and says that they feel good about the prospects of a deal. It was Caroline Levitt who was talking to reporters at the White House and added, it's obviously in the best interests of Iran to meet the president's demands, adding a second round of negotiations will be very likely and also will be held back in Islamabad. So hopefully it's going in the right directions. As you can just see coming up on your screen, the Strait of Hormuz and what the US has been doing with blockading Iran's ports to put pressure on Iran in order for them to come to the table and agree to the US's terms, especially regarding nuclear weapons that the US says they are not to have. Now, also just to add, a resolution aimed at limiting President Donald Trump's ability to wage war in Iran has failed in the US Senate for the fourth time, and we'll bring you more on that story later on in the program, just because there was a number of Democrats that had planned to stop Trump in his tracks in relation to the measures he's taking, especially when it comes to the war in Iran. And a number of lawmakers are not happy with how it's going. Okay, now let's turn to our next website, and that's on the BBC, and that's in relation to Türkiye and deadly shootings that took place. 9 people have been killed in the second Turkish school shooting in 2 days. Now, we know that there were at least 8 students and 1 teacher that have been killed and several others injured following a shooting in the southern part of Turkey. Now, the incident happened at the Asa Kalik Secondary School in Turkey's southeastern region, and 13 people were also wounded, leaving 6 in critical condition. It said that it was a 14-year-old attacker who was killed during the incident. We don't know whether or not that it was a former pupil or a pupil at the school, but we will bring you more information throughout the course of the program. But it also, just to add, it comes a day after 16 people were injured after a former student in a different school opened fire at a high school also in the south of the country before killing himself. So the motive is still unknown in this particular attack that you can see here on the screen, and an investigation has been launched. Now, Turkish media reported that the attacker, believed to be a student, entered 2 classrooms and had 5 guns and 7 magazines with him, and said that the weapons belonged to the student's former police officer father, and that the attacker's father has now since been detained by police, according to local media. But as I mentioned, we will definitely provide you with a little bit more detail in regards to this story and what took place and the tragic scenes that led to a number of young people dying, including the attacker who was aged 14. Okay, now let's move over to another story that we reported on earlier this year, especially in February, and that's on CNN. Chinese man jailed after trying to smuggle 2,200 ants out of Kenya in his luggage. Now, a Chinese national was sentenced to attempting to smuggle live queen garden ants out of Kenya. Now, we reported on this earlier when he was first charged for doing this, and now the trial has been brought to an end, and the court in Nairobi on Wednesday also fined another guy, as another Kenyan national in relation to this. But Zhang Kikun was fined $1 million Kenyan shillings, which works out roughly 7,700 US dollars. Now, the judge there described Zhang as not entirely honest and lacking remorse. And as I mentioned, a Kenyan man, Charles Mwangi, was also charged in the case and accused of supplying the ants to Zhang. Last month, he was charged with illegally dealing with this wildlife species as he was attempting to board a plane to travel to China with the 2,000 live ants in his luggage before being caught. Now, just so you know, these particular ants, you might be wondering why, what's the deal behind it? They can be worth around $220 each. So it's actually quite a lucrative business, especially within China. So that's one of the reasons why this Chinese national wanted to take these ants back home to where he is from in regards to Kenya and what's happening there. But as I mentioned, we'll provide you with more information in relation to this story. Okay, well, that's your press roundup for now. Now we'll go to a quick break. When I return, I'll discuss the rest of the global stories.
Hello and welcome to Prime Time. What a show we've got lined up for you today. In a complex world, clarity is power. Two hours live, diplomacy dissected in a spin-free environment. That's Prime Time with me, Guy Schoen, weekdays on A News.
Inside Politics delves deeply into the heart of global issues shaping our world today. Join me for your go-to source of political analysis from across the region and beyond.
Welcome to A News, unfiltered news and analysis from the region and beyond. From Washington to Beijing, Tehran to Kabul, to Tbilisi to Tashkent. Hello, I'm Jay. That's challenges.
Today is the third.
We're with you 24/7, taking you live to the front lines of the day's biggest stories.
Welcome to Gabon. One important note to this. I'm here.
Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Hello, we are reporting on the 8th of November.
Reporting from Paris,
Dar es Salaam, Tel Aviv,
Washington,
London,
Moscow,
Kyiv, Berlin,
Rio de Janeiro, Beijing, Bangkok, Tbilisi, Tashkent, Almaty, Kazakhstan, Port Sudan, Tehran, Islamabad, Istanbul,
Kabul, for A News.
Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak. Now let's have a look at the global stories. We head first over to Israel. And Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says its forces are stepping up strikes on Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. He said the military is close to overwhelming the town, described as a key stronghold, while reinforcing a security zone along the border.
We are about to overwhelm Bint Jbeil. We are about to essentially eliminate this great stronghold of Hezbollah. In talks with Lebanon, there are two main objectives: dismantling of Hezbollah and sustainable peace that is achieved through strength.
In southern Lebanon, staying on this area, efforts are underway to help children displaced by the conflict cope with trauma as violence continues and diplomatic talks show cautious signs of progress.
At a school-turned shelter in the southern city of Tyre, children gathered not for lessons, but for relief. Drawing, colouring and storytelling sessions are offering a brief escape from the realities of war, part of an initiative aimed at helping young people process trauma. The programme was launched at the start of the conflict to support families forced from their homes.
My daughter was very bored, often feeling uncomfortable sitting alone in the room. Here, when children started drawing, they began to express themselves after everything they'd been through. I love it. It boosts children's morale.
But for many families, the psychological impact runs deep.
There are many things that have negatively affected my daughter. She developed fear, she developed a phobia of something called sound, of something called shelling, of seeing blood, destruction. Yes, she developed a fear of this.
Psychologists say children remain in the earliest stages of trauma.
Now, children are in what we call the initial trauma phase. The most important thing they need is to feel safe in their surroundings. We can't offer them anything more than that. They've experienced trauma and are still experiencing it. We can't just start treatment now. There's anxiety, there's fear, there's tension, there's worry about the surroundings. Some are afraid of losing their homes, losing their families. Some children have nightmares. Some aren't sleeping properly.
The war began on March 2nd when Hezbollah opened fire in support of Tehran, triggering an Israeli offensive. Lebanese authorities say more than 2,000 people have been killed and around 1.2 million displaced. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts are tentatively moving forward. In a rare development, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosted direct talks between Israel and Lebanon, the first in decades. The talks mark an unusual step between two countries that have technically remained at war since 1948 and underline the urgency for a resolution as civilians, especially children, continue to bear the cost. Even as activities continue, the sound of nearby strikes remains a constant threat. Bitar says they are heightening fear and anxiety, with many children facing repeated loss, but support efforts are continuing to help them cope.
Turning to America, and the U.S. Senate has rejected two resolutions aimed at blocking nearly $500 million in proposed arms sales to Israel. The measures were introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders and sought to stop the transfer of bombs and armored bulldozers to the Israeli government. In votes held on Wednesday, the Senate opposed both efforts. Lawmakers voted 40 to 59 against a motion to block a $295 million sale of armored bulldozers. A second resolution to block the sale of 1,000-pound bombs was also rejected. Russian forces launched new strikes on several Ukrainian cities early this morning, killing at least 3 people, including a child, and injuring more than 20 others. According to officials in the capital of Kyiv, 2 people, including a child, were killed when drones and missile debris hit residential areas. A separate strike in the Dnipro killed 1 person, while in Odessa, an apartment building strike killed 1 person and wounded 6 others. Meanwhile, Russian authorities claim that Ukrainian drone attacks killed 2 children and damaged homes and facilities. The UK's economy outlook has worsened, with fresh forecasts signalling slower growth, rising inflation and mounting strain on households. Our A News' Zainab Faridza has more on this report from Manchester.
Britain's economic outlook has taken a significant hit, with the International Monetary Fund delivering the sharpest downgrade among major advanced economies. The IMF now expects the UK economy to grow by just 0.8% in 2026, down from a previous forecast of 1.3%, placing Britain at the bottom of the G7 when measured per person. The downgrade is being driven largely by the ongoing conflict involving Iran, which has pushed up global energy prices. The IMF says that the war initially doubled in natural gas costs, a major issue for the UK, which remains heavily reliant on inputs. The surges in energy prices is also expected to delay interest rate cuts from the Bank of England, keeping borrowing costs higher for longer and adding further pressure on households and businesses. UK Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves has criticized the United States' handling of the conflict, describing the lack of a clear strategy as a folly and warning that the consequences are being felt globally, including by families across Britain. At the same time, unemployment is expected to rise, with the IMF forecasting a rate of 5.6% this year. Inflation, which has already been persistently high in the UK, is now projected to peak at around 4% in 2026, higher than previously expected, before gradually easing back to the Bank of England's 2% target by the end of 2027. Economists warn their figures highlight a deeper issue: the UK's vulnerability to global shocks, particularly due to its dependence on fossil fuels. The government says it is now considering targeted support for households and businesses struggling with rising energy costs. But analysts say balancing that support with already stretched public finances will be a major challenge in the months ahead. Zena Farizadeh, News, Manchester, United Kingdom.
Now to Australia, and one of the last two refineries in the country, Viva at Geelong City, caught on fire overnight, slashing petrol production at the facility and sparking price and supply concerns.
A major fire has broken out overnight at Viva Energy's oil refinery in Geelong on Wednesday. The blaze began late that evening at the facility, about an hour from Melbourne, one of Australia's last two operational refineries. The incident comes amid growing concerns about global fuel supply, after Iran moved to effectively close the Strait of Hormuz, following recent attacks by the United States and Israel. The fire, believed to have been caused by equipment failure, engulfed 2 units of the plant, which supplies more than half of Victoria's fuel needs. There are no reports of casualties.
Whilst the fire is not yet under control, the fire has been contained to the MoGas plant and to an area of approximately 30 metres by 30 metres, and also through some platform and infrastructure areas. Large quantities of water has been used to cool and contain the fire, and that will continue to happen all day. Isolation valves have been activated to isolate as much as the plant as possible.
Australian Energy Minister Chris Bowen stated that the situation would primarily affect gasoline production.
It will have an impact, but at this point, production of diesel and jet fuel does continue, and no reason to believe at this point that there's need to stop that. The impact on petrol production, I'm sure petrol production will continue, but it may be impacted for some time, obviously.
The Geelong refinery can process up to 120,000 barrels of oil per day and employs more than 1,100 people. It supplies over 50% of Victoria's fuel and around 10% of Australia's total fuel demand. Authorities say the situation remains under close watch, with the full impact on fuel supply and refinery operations expected to become clearer in the coming days.
We head over to South America, and protests have erupted in Caracas, with demonstrators demanding justice for detainees and better living conditions. Relatives of political prisoners accuse authorities of abuse and inhumane conditions at a maximum security prison. In a separate rally near the Supreme Court, public workers and retirees called for higher wages and long-delayed pension reform, saying incomes no longer cover basic needs and low pay is driving migration. This comes after acting President Delcy Rodriguez said her government will make a responsible increase to workers' income on the 1st of May, but many say they want it now. Tensions over Taiwan are once again in focus, with China firmly rejecting U.S. accusations of military pressure. Beijing insists its actions are routine, while warning against what it sees as external interference. For more, we head to Manu Makdoum in Beijing.
China has strongly rejected recent U.S. claims that it is exerting military pressures on Taiwan, calling the allegations a distortion of facts, driven by what Beijing describes as malicious intentions. A spokesperson for China's Taiwan Affairs Office, Chen Binhua, stressed that Taiwan is an internal matter for China and warned against external interference. He said that China's military activities around the island are routine and necessary steps to safeguard national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Beijing reaffirmed that peaceful reunification remains its preferred direction, emphasizing that closer cross-strait integration would bring clear economic and social benefits to the people of Taiwan, including improved livelihoods and development opportunities. China also reiterated its firm opposition to U.S. armed sales to Taiwan, describing them as a destabilizing factor that undermines peace and trust in the region. The remarks follow recent U.S. calls for Beijing to reduce military activity and engage in dialogue with Taiwan, which China dismissed as interference in its internal affairs. Despite differences, Chinese officials continue to highlight openness to constructive engagement based on peaceful development, while maintaining that national reunification is a historic and inevitable process. Manu Makdoum, A News, Beijing.
Pope Leo XIV is continuing his Africa tour with a strong message on peace. He arrived in the mineral-rich country of Cameroon and was greeted by tens of thousands who lined the streets to welcome his visit, while he also delivered a speech on combating corruption. Here's this report.
Pope Leo XIV has arrived in Cameroon, pressing ahead with a message of peace and justice despite sharp criticism from Donald Trump. Trump has repeatedly criticised the Pope during his Africa tour over his views on global conflicts and social issues. In response, the pontiff did not name him directly, but stressed the need for dialogue, saying people can live together in peace despite their differences. Speaking in the capital Yaoundé, he urged leaders to take a bold leap forward and warned that corruption undermines trust in authority. Addressing Paul Biya, the president of Cameroon, he said the chains of corruption must be broken for justice to prevail.
Hearts must be set free from an idolatrous thirst for profit. True profit comes from integral human development. That is, the balanced growth of all the aspects that make life on this earth a blessing.
He also called for an end to violence in Cameroon's English-speaking regions, where a separatist conflict has claimed thousands of lives. During his three-day visit, he is expected to travel to Bamenda for a peace meeting, with armed groups announcing a temporary pause in fighting. Crowds gathered in Yaoundé to welcome the Pope, singing and dancing in scenes reflecting hope for change and unity. The Cameroon leg is part of a broader 10-day Africa tour that includes Angola and Equatorial Guinea. A major mass is expected in Douala, where large crowds are anticipated. Before arriving in Cameroon, Pope Leo visited Algeria, where he promoted interfaith dialogue and peaceful coexistence. In Annaba, he highlighted the teachings of St. Augustine of Hippo, urging unity across religions. Throughout the trip, the Pope has maintained a consistent message. Peace, respect and justice must prevail over division, regardless of political pressure.
Now over to the west part of Africa, and rising fuel prices in Nigeria are pushing up food costs, adding pressure to households and the government ahead of the upcoming elections next year.
Nigeria's inflation rate rose in March for the first time in a year, driven largely by higher fuel costs linked to the Middle East conflict. Food inflation climbed to 14.31% year on year, while overall inflation reached 15.38%, according to official data. At markets in Lagos, traders and drivers say rising transport costs are making food more expensive and harder to sell.
Transport before was between 3,500 naira to 4,500 to deliver a basket of tomatoes. But now, because of fuel, it is between 8,000 to 10,000 for transport from Kano to Lagos, one basket.
Sellers say the pressure is worsened by the perishable nature of goods, forcing them to sell quickly, often at a loss.
Once we bring our produce and drop it here, it is now compulsory to sell it off at any cost because it is a perishable good and will spoil. We can't even hold on it for 3 days.
Drivers also point to worsening conditions, with rising fuel prices and poor roads adding to costs across the supply chain. The price surge follows months of easing inflation, highlighting the impact of global tensions on Nigeria's economy.
We now head to the eastern part of Africa, and a Kenyan court has handed a Chinese national a jail sentence after he was caught trying to smuggle thousands of live ants out of the country in order to pay over $7,000. Here's more on that story.
A Kenyan court has fined a Chinese national 1 million shillings, about $8,000, and handed him a jail sentence for attempting to smuggle thousands of live ants out of the country. Authorities say the man was arrested at Nairobi's main international airport with more than 2,200 garden ants hidden in his luggage, in a case highlighting growing concerns over wildlife trafficking. The court said tougher penalties are needed to deter a rise in such incidents, as demand grows in overseas markets where collectors keep ant colonies for study. His lawyer said the sentence includes both a fine and a custodial term.
It has been fined 1 million in default to serve 12 months imprisonment, and due to in the court's view that his level of involvement in the alleged offence is so huge, he has, in addition to the 12 months, he has been given another 12 months to serve. That will serve a consecutive.
The defendant had initially denied the charges before later pleading guilty. His legal team says an appeal will be filed. Wildlife experts say the case reflects a broader shift in illegal trafficking, moving away from high-profile items like ivory towards lesser-known species.
Over to a quick break now. When I return, I'll take a look at the regional headlines and we'll be joined by a guest to further dig into some of those stories. Don't go anywhere.
We are in Somalia, a place often used through the illusion of constant danger.
Somalia is already facing security threats from groups like Al-Shabaab.
deaths. Currently, Somalia has 3.4 million people internally displaced.
Mr. President, I want you to know that I'm signing now Israel's official recognition of Somaliland.
We are expecting all member states of the United Nations to recognize Somaliland.
We strongly rejected Prime Minister Netanyahu's illegal aggression in recognizing part of Somalia.
A conflict will last. People make so much money on it.
This country sits at the crossroads between instability and order, isolation and connection, risks and responsibility.
Hello and welcome to Primetime. What a show we've got lined up for you today. In a complex world, clarity is power. Two hours live, diplomacy dissected in a spin-free environment. That's Prime Time with me, Guy Schoen, weekdays on A News.
Welcome back and thank you for joining me this morning. Now we'll head to the stories in the region and first to a fatal shooting in Türkiye. Now the death toll from a school shooting in the southern eastern part of Türkiye has risen, with officials confirming multiple casualties. It comes a day after 16 people were injured after a former student opened fire at another high school, also in the south of the country, before killing himself. Here's more on that story.
The death toll from the school shooting in Turkey's southeastern province of Kahramanmaraş has risen to at least 9, with 13 others wounded, according to updated official figures. Authorities say a 14-year-old student opened fire inside the school, killing 8 students and 1 teacher. 6 of the injured remain in intensive care, with 3 in critical condition.
Just as the morning students were leaving, a 14-year-old student in the 8th grade, who was also attending school in the afternoon, entered 2 classrooms with weapons he brought from home and opened fire indiscriminately, causing a massacre at the school. As a result of this incident, we have 9 deaths. 8 of them are students and 1 is a teacher. In addition, we have 13 wounded. 6 of the injured are in intensive care. 3 of them are in critical condition.
Officials say the suspect acted alone and described the attack as an isolated incident, not linked to terrorism. The shooting comes just 1 day after a separate school attack in Şanlıurfa, where at least 16 people were wounded, raising concerns after 2 rare incidents in consecutive days.
Now, Iran has condemned recent U.S. and Israeli strikes on civilian facilities, including hospitals and schools, saying they violate international law. President Masoud Pezeshkian said Iran does not seek war and remains open to dialogue despite the escalation. Here's what he had to say.
When they attack schools and maternity wards in hospitals, they don't respect any humanitarian principles. It's shameful and the world needs to see this. They claim we are terrorists, but they are the real terrorists who massacre anyone, anywhere, anytime they want. Now they stand on the stage and talk about human rights. It's shameful.
Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif held talks with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Jeddah on Wednesday as part of a regional tour to end the war in Iran. 2 leaders reviewed developments surrounding U.S.-Iran talks and stressed the importance of sustained diplomatic engagement to restore stability in the region. They also discussed close bilateral relations, exploring ways to expand cooperation across various fields. The talks come as Pakistan plays a key a mediating role in efforts to ease tensions between the US and Iran following weeks of conflict in the region. Now, the European Union's planned civilian mission to Armenia comes as the Strait of Hormuz crisis exposes the region's vulnerability to external shocks. While the EU focuses on strengthening Armenia's resilience to hybrid threats, railway transit through Azerbaijan has helped cushion economic pressure, highlighting the growing role of regional connectivity. Against this backdrop, several critical questions emerge, and to help tackle those questions is Chingiz Mammadov, research alumni at the Ned and Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Good morning.
Good morning, Nadia. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. My first question in regards to the EU's planned mission to Armenia. What can the European Union civilian mission complement rather than complicate the progressing normalization between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
This mission is the second European Union mission. First was on the border. And seemingly this second mission looks like more positive because it contributes to the process of, let's say, accepting by Armenian society new realities. And Armenia experienced actually a very heavy shock because just 5 years ago, slightly more than 5 years ago, Armenia lived in completely different reality. They lived in wrong paradigms about Great Armenia, Armenia from sea to the sea. And then, you know, this 44 days war, then one day special operation, and Armenia started to realize that these narratives, which were actually implemented to Armenian society from the outside, they are wrong. And they now have to accept this reality. And, you know, in English, there are two words for elections and for choice. But for example, in some languages, including in Russia, there are close words, you know, выборы and выбор. So Armenia is not only going to elections, they are going to make a choice. It's much bigger than simply elections. Armenia have to choose between past wrong perceptions and new realities. And what Pashinyan and his team are doing during last couple of years, since 2023, they are trying to explain to Armenians that there are only two choices for Armenia. One, to live in peace with the neighbors, and first of all with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Or second, to continue this wrong path, which did nothing positive for Armenia during last actually last 35-40 years, not only last 5-6 years, because even without Azerbaijani winning the Second Karabakh War, Armenia was losing population. You know, winning country lost almost 1/3 of its population after Soviet time. That's why Pashinyan tries to instill into Armenian society this feeling, and seemingly he is successful. Currently, his rating is higher than his competitors before elections. So, European Union tries to contribute to this process positively, first by kind of enhancing status of Pashinyan and his team as leading force. And we know that there are two events expected in May, just before elections. First, EU-Armenia summit, and secondly, European Community Summit. Two events, two very big events. So they will contribute to Armenians' overall standing in the eyes of Armenian population. But there are, Nadia, also some, let's say, negative. What I've spoken before that was positive. But I watched yesterday interview by Benjamin Haddad. This is French ambassador of France to EU. And actually, his messages were not positive. First, he again has spoken about centrality of Armenia for geostrategic, you know, kind of views from Europe. And secondly, again, you know, this, I'm sorry, I will be straightforward, this BC about, you know, genocide, blah, 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 you know. I think it's unacceptable. If you are going to contribute, if Pashinyan, Prime Minister of Armenia, spoken negatively about so-called genocide, why again, you know, such a high position person.
He's saying it again.
Yes, again touching this issue. He would simply, for example, avoid this, you know. And so the question is whether we're talking about European Union position, or again, country like France dominates EU position. And France actually, in my humble opinion, occupies not right place in general in geopolitics overall. This is artificial place created by France after Second World War, and they actually misuse this position. They always play the role of, let's say, going against realities. What I mean under that? Even before Second Karabakh War, it was clear that Azerbaijan is gaining strength, that Azerbaijan starts playing higher role. And for example, by meeting in Washington D.C. on August 8, the United States accepted the realities that were created in the South Caucasus and in general in our region. Countries like France are going against this current. And I understand that sometimes some political forces, some figures can go against some current, but at least to incorporate this, to make this process smoothly. France does it, in a very rude, in a very incorrect and unacceptable way.
Right.
So I think it's positive, especially because EU actually tries to diminish influence of Russia, especially with cyber attacks during election, maybe even using some, let's say, leverages like military bases in Armenia, people that work for these military bases because they're actually gaining money from working for Russian military bases. So this is positive overall, and it contributes to positive process between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But by statements made by this Benjamin Haddad, it makes Azerbaijan again nervous, and again Azerbaijan should be prepared for different scenarios.
I see, and just because that was so much in your answer, I just want to kind of bring it to the extent of what the Hormuz crisis in the region, especially in relation to the Israel, Iran and U.S. war. Does that reinforce the strategic importance of regional connectivity, particularly the railway transit through Azerbaijan?
Yeah, definitely, because what happens, it happens just next door. It's in Iran. And Iran plays an important role in this region. I'm not saying positive role. It plays both positive and negative, but important role. First of all, for example, it supplies Armenia with very necessary commodities and energy. Now, under situation of war, opportunities for Iran to supply these goods to Armenia are diminished. That's why role of Azerbaijan increases, especially if we take into account position of Russia as well. Let's recall a recent meeting between Pashinyan and Putin. Actually, there were direct threats, by Putin that we're supplying Armenia with cheap gas, several times lower than world market prices. So it was direct threat. In this regard, now supply of energy to Armenia from Azerbaijan, through Azerbaijan, and by Azerbaijan are playing important role in overall energy security of Armenia and in general, overall prosperity, especially before elections. Regarding this trip road over Zangezur corridor, I think now the opportunity for Iran to interfere into this process are diminished because they are busy now with their own security. We haven't heard recently any statements like previously from Iranian side that they consider this trip road through Zangezur as something unacceptable. We haven't heard that. At the same time, there were some, these artillery shootings and attacks, drone attacks to Azerbaijan, actually drone attacks to Azerbaijan. So this is complicated process. There are signs to realize by Iran importance was Azerbaijan, and let me recall also agreement reached yesterday regarding plane shoot by Russia.
Yes.
I think this is important event. Russia also realized importance of Azerbaijan, because if Russia wants to be a friend with Iran and supply Iran at least with humanitarian good. I don't know anything else, but at least humanitarian goods are transferred. So in this case, Azerbaijan is crucial for this.
Yes, no, definitely. It's showing how important the South Caucasus and that railway link is. Now, could you say Armenia's increasing reliance then on EU-supported security frameworks create new perceptions of alignment that influence trust and cooperation within the region?
EU in general considers Armenia as a first in the South Caucasus, especially after its relations with Georgia became, let's say, soft word, complicated. Yeah, that's why they now rely very strongly on Armenia, and Azerbaijan conducts independent policy. EU doesn't like independence of Azerbaijan. It's clear, because all the aims, and even before Second Karabakh War, after Second Karabakh War, were aimed to make Azerbaijan more kind of listening to EU. Azerbaijan conducts independent policy, pursues its own national interests, which not always coincide with EU interests in the region. For example, EU wanted to dominate in this region. Most likely they want to get also some benefits from Trip Road. They expressed desire to kind of contribute financially or in other ways. But United States took initiative, especially by seeing that EU is inactive. They thought that, actually very interesting moment here, Nadia, because previously EU actually worked in tandem with Russia. It may seem a little bit, kind of unusual, but in reality, what EU did in the past was close to what Russia did in the past. And there were very interesting links between France especially and Russia in relation to South Caucasus. They worked together. United States actually intervened into this process and took initiative. And now EU saw that they are losing the ground, that they are losing opportunities to even somehow benefit from that process, and they are now making a kind of fast steps. But again, if you want to make fast steps, you have to take balanced position, not again one-sided, which was expressed by this Benjamin Haddad, which was just yesterday in Armenia.
Yes, yes. It's really interesting, and it's interesting to find out where do we go from here, because you want Azerbaijan to make sure that they express their own national interests, but at the same time you can see influences from the EU and other Western powers and how that will have an impact on the South Caucasus going forward. And just very, very quickly, if you can have in 1 minute just to round up, what are your thoughts for the future of the South Caucasus with the EU?
In general, geopolitics map of reality changes. Azerbaijan accepted this, and new reality is that there is stronger Turkey, there is stronger Azerbaijan, and even Iran by its resistance shows that it's new reality. Hegemony of the United States and EU ended. It's going to end. To the process. That's why I think regional players will play a bigger role, including Turkey and Azerbaijan. And I think EU simply needs time to accept this reality and work in accordance with this new reality.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Mr. Mammadov, for your insights there. Thank you. Right. Over to another story, and can the European Union know, because we've just finished that particular one, so I'm just going to quickly head over to our next story, and that's in regards to Azerbaijan Airlines crash is now moving into a phase of formal closure. Azerbaijan and Russia have agreed terms following the downing of a passenger jet, with compensation settled and circumstances acknowledged. Let's go to that story.
Azerbaijan and Russia have reached a formal settlement over the crash of an Azerbaijan Airlines passenger jet in December 2024. The agreement was confirmed in a joint statement issued by both countries' foreign ministries. Officials say all outstanding issues have now been resolved, including compensation payments to the victims' families. The statement acknowledges that the aircraft was brought down by the unintentional action of a Russian air defense system while flying in Russian airspace. The settlement follows talks between the presidents of the two countries held in Dushanbe in October 2025. Both sides say the agreement reflects a commitment to maintaining close cooperation and strengthening ties based on mutual respect. The ministries also renewed their condolences, describing the crash as an irreparable loss. The Embraer 190 aircraft had been travelling from Baku to Grozny when it was hit during its approach. Severely damaged, the pilots attempted to divert and make an emergency landing, but the plane crashed near Aktau in Kazakhstan. There were 67 people on board. 38 were killed, while 29 survived.
It's now time to take a quick break. When I return, I'll have a full update on the latest headlines, plus a look at what's making the front pages this morning. Stay with me.
We are in Somalia, a place often used through the illusion of constant danger.
Somalia is already facing security threats from groups like Al-Shabaab.
Currently, Somalia has 3.4 million people internally displaced.
Mr. President, I want you to know that I'm signing now Israel's official recognition of Somaliland.
We are expecting all member states of the United Nations to recognize Somaliland.
We strongly rejected Prime Minister Netanyahu's illegal aggression in recognizing part of Somalia.
A conflict will last. People make so much money on it.
This country sits at the crossroads between instability and order, isolation and connection, risks and responsibility.
On World Business, we meet the boardroom leaders making market-moving decisions. And find out how leaders are dealing with continuous technological disruption. Welcome to A News, unfiltered news and analysis from the region and beyond. From Washington to Beijing, Tehran to Kabul, to Tbilisi to Tashkent. Hello, I'm Jay. That's challenges.
Today is the third.
We're with you 24/7, taking you live to the front lines of the day's biggest stories. Welcome to Gabala. Hi, Candy. One important note to this.
I'm here.
Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Hello, we're reporting on the 8th of November.
Reporting from Paris,
Dar es Salaam, Tel Aviv,
Washington,
London,
Moscow,
Kyiv, Berlin,
Rio de Janeiro,
Beijing,
Bangkok,
Tbilisi, Tashkent,
Almaty, Kazakhstan,
Port Sudan,
Tehran, Islamabad,
Istanbul,
Kabul for A News.
Hello, you're watching Daybreak live on A News, and if you're just joining me, I'm your host Nadia Jani, here to take you through the day's top stories. So let's take a look at the headlines. US and Iran are in indirect talks to extend 2-week ceasefire, which is due to end next week. Pope Leo visits Cameroon with message of peace in the middle of attacks from Trump. And Russia launches new strikes on several Ukrainian cities, killing at least 3 people. Now let's take a look at the stories making the front pages this morning, and we head first to The Guardian and what's happened in relation to a meeting that has brought more than $1 billion pledged for Sudan as humanitarian crisis deepens. Now it's stated that it was roughly 1.8 billion has been pledged for Sudan at a conference in Berlin that took place on Wednesday. Now it's going far beyond the funding target that many delegates thought they'll be able to achieve. And Antonio Guterres, which is the United Nations Secretary General, is that this nightmare must end, was his comment in regards to that. Now the financial commitment will also help offset a chronic humanitarian funding shortfall that has been brought about because of 3 years of the conflict impacting 2/3 of the population, which is roughly 34 million people who require aid and assistance. Now, however, the prospect of peace wasn't really discussed, and it seems to be distant as ever, with little progress made on ceasefire talks. But neither Sudan's warring parties, the Parliamentary Rapid Support Forces, which is the RSF, and the army travelled to Berlin to discuss anything in regards to this particular raising of funds. Now, Sudan's army-aligned foreign ministry has actually denounced delegates for not consulting it first, accusing Western countries of colonial tutelage approach, which it is not happy with. And also, in this particular meeting outside Germany's foreign ministry, hundreds of protesters assembled, many chanting against the United Arab Emirates' connection and support to the alleged support for the RSF, which says that it is contributing to continue the conflict in Sudan, which, as I mentioned, is in its 3rd year. Now let's move over to our next story this morning, and that's on the CNN website. That's in regards to a Chinese man being jailed after trying to smuggle over 2,000 ants out of Kenya in his luggage. Now he was sentenced to a year in prison for attempting to smuggle live queen garden ants out of Kenya, and the court in Nairobi also fined Zhang Keegan 1 million Kenyan shillings, which works out at $7,737. Now, the judge has described Zhang as not entirely honest about the dealings and lacking in remorse. A Kenyan man, Charles Mwangwi, was also charged in this case and was accused of supplying the ants to Zhang. Now, last month, he was charged with illegally dealing in a wildlife species after being arrested in Nairobi's main airport after he was attempting to catch a flight back to China with these ants in his luggage. Now, Kenyan authorities have warned of the growing demand for ants in Europe and Asia, where they are prized by collectors and in some cases are worth over $200 each. So it's a lucrative wildlife trafficking smuggling, you could say, in regards to this, that some individuals are a part of, and Kenya is trying to be as harsh with its sentencing in regards to that to deter others from doing exactly the same thing. Okay, now let's go to the next story today, which is making headlines, and that's on the New York Times website in relation to what's happening in Iran and the US, and Pakistani mediators have arrived in Iran to keep peace talks alive. Now, they arrived yesterday in regards to making sure they could continue talks to help shoring up a ceasefire between Iran and the US before it expires next week. Now, Iran has continued to exchange messages through Pakistan to the US in regards to the talks, which ended without an agreement on Sunday last week. And we know that the US has been putting extra pressure on Iran. As you can see here, the Strait of Hormuz, they've been adding blockades to Iran ports in making sure that they are impacted economically so that they're able to come to the table with some form of agreement. Now, the White House secretary says that they feel good about the prospect of a deal and hopefully say that it's in Iran's best interest to actually meet the president's demands. And just to remind you of what those demands are by US President Donald Trump is that he wants to make sure there are no nuclear weapons in Iran at all, something that Iran says they don't have, but they do have a nuclear program in Iran, which they want to continue with, which they say is not harmful to any of the neighboring countries there. But we will give you the update in regards to these talks and when the next one will be in relation to all of that happening there. Okay, now let's go to the next story, and that's in staying on this subject. And US President Donald Trump said it is very possible possible the US could reach a peace deal with Iran before King Charles III's visit later this month. Talks between Washington and Tehran continue, with officials reporting progress toward a possible framework agreement, although major differences remain. The White House says discussions on further negotiations are ongoing, with no date yet set for the next meeting. Iran reports that talks are continuing through Pakistani mediation and insists the US must prove its sincerity, while also adding it is open to discussing uranium enrichment but maintains its right to nuclear energy. The US President Donald Trump says talks between Israel and Lebanon are set to take place today, on Thursday. In a post on Truth's social platform, Trump said the aim is to create what he called a little breathing room between the two sides. Trump noted that it has been a long time since their leaders last spoke. He did not provide further details about the planned discussions. The diplomatic push comes as hostilities continue on the ground, with 3 paramedics killed on Wednesday in an Israeli strike in Lebanon, despite ongoing ceasefire efforts. Staying in North America, the U.S. Senate has rejected 2 resolutions aimed at blocking nearly $500 million in proposed arms sales to Israel. The measures were introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders and sought to stop the transfer of bombs and armored bulldozers to the Israeli government. In votes held on Wednesday, the Senate opposed both efforts. Lawmakers voted 40 to 59 against a motion to block a $295 million sale of armored bulldozers. A second resolution to block the sale of 1,000-pound bombs was also rejected. One of the last refineries in Australia, Viva in Geelong City, caught on fire overnight, slashing petrol production at the facility and sparking price and supply concerns. Here's the report.
A major fire has broken out overnight at Viva Energy's oil refinery in Geelong on Wednesday. The blaze began late that evening at the facility, about an hour from Melbourne, one of Australia's last 2 operational refineries. The incident comes amid growing concerns about global fuel supply after Iran moved to effectively close the Strait of Hormuz, following recent attacks by the United States and Israel. The fire, believed to have been caused by equipment failure, engulfed 2 units of the plant, which supplies more than half of Victoria's fuel needs. There are no reports of casualties.
Whilst the fire is not yet under control, the fire has been contained to the MoGas plant and to an area of approximately 30 metres by 30 metres, and also through some platform and infrastructure areas. Large quantities of water has been used to cool and contain the fire, and that will continue to happen all day. Isolation valves have been activated to isolate as much as the plant as possible.
Australian Energy Minister Chris Bowen stated that the situation would primarily affect gasoline production.
It will have an impact, but at this point, production of diesel and jet fuel does continue, and no reason to believe at this point that there's need to stop that. The impact on petrol production, I'm sure petrol production will continue, but it may be impacted for some time, obviously.
The Geelong refinery can process up to 120,000 barrels of oil per day and employs more than 1,100 people. It supplies over 50% of Victoria's fuel and around 10% of Australia's total fuel demand. Authorities say the situation remains under close watch, with the full impact on fuel supply and refinery operations expected to become clearer in the coming days.
We turn now to the east of Europe, and Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky is to be presented with the International Four Freedoms Award. The accolade is to honor him and the Ukrainian people for their courageous fight for freedom and democracy under extremely challenging conditions. It comes against the backdrop and the continued fighting in Kyiv and delay in peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Here to further discuss this with me is geopolitical analyst Umesh Kumar Agarwal, who is joining me this morning from India. Thank you this morning. Hello.
Hello, thank you very much.
My first question in regards to Ukraine and Russia is that the temporary ceasefire that we saw was announced over the Orthodox Easter holiday was very much short-lived. What does that tell us about the continued fighting between Russia and Ukraine?
It's since 4.5 years the war is continuing, and the Ukrainian people have demonstrated their resolve to fight Russia, which is militarily very much stronger than them. But still, the Ukrainian forces were able to hold the Russian onslaught. And right now, if you see, there is no territorial expansion. But what is happening right now is that precision strikes are happening through unmanned combat aerial vehicles. And few days back, if you see, the Ukrainian drones had actually traveled deep inside Russia, and they had destroyed around 40% of Russia's export of natural crude oil. This is going to be a major problem for the Russia as well. Earlier, they had destroyed their fertilizer plants also. So right now, Russia is halting exports, and also, if you see, Ukraine is trying to cripple the Russian way of raising resources. Similarly, Russia is also striking deep inside Kyiv, and right now, the Ukrainian president is abroad seeking much more military supplies. And this war looks like it is just like going on, and each one wants to bleed each other with precision strikes and critical infrastructure facilities, so that they are not able to raise resources. This is what I get it.
Yes, and obviously we know that there were some strikes earlier this morning as well that we also reported on in the programme. Do you think there's any type of compromise the two sides could come together and agree upon in order to end this war, or are we just going to continue seeing back and forth strikes between the two?
The thing is, the first theater of conflict, Ukraine and Russia, is going for the past 4 years plus, and also the Israel and Iran war is ongoing. There are talks about possible flare-up in the South China Sea as well, because North Korea is ramping up its missiles against South Korea and Japan, and similarly we are seeing that China is becoming more adventurous with respect to Taiwan. So if you see anything happening in the South China Sea, I believe that the Russia and Ukraine conflict might come to an end. There might be a temporary ceasefire as well. And also, if you see that the European economy is right now gripping into recession, and one more thing, I believe that if that arms sales, the arms supply stops, things could return to normal. Even in Russia, they have suffered a lot. All of them want an honorable exit through the war. This is what I get, and the fatigue factor has set in, and no one is a clear winner in this war. It is ultimately the people of Russia and Ukraine. They are suffering due to constant hits on the infrastructure facilities, and this has to stop at some time. We cannot allow this to happen, and this is a point of no return. There are no territorial advancements as well. This is what I get it.
Yes, well, the chair of the foundation who's presenting the Four Freedom Awards to Zelensky later today is saying that this is also a message to the US. Do you think that that message will be heard by the US, and what would that help for the US to turn their attention towards Ukraine, just because they have been quite fully consumed with what's happening in the Middle East with Iran?
The basic point is the Americans will have to understand that they need to go for a viable solution with Iran, and Iran is having only 60% of the enriched uranium. That is also Israel claims that they have it. but we do not know how do we determine it. But on the other hand, you see that the Americans are constantly aiding Pakistan, which has a declared 170 nuclear projectiles, and it's the army is also in hand in gloves with the terrorist groups. So lot of duplicity has to be addressed. But it's good to see that the Netherlands government has honored the Ukrainian people for their resolve to fight for democracy, to fight against an invasion, and this invasion has to end somewhere. It's point of no return. I really feel bad when I see the images of destroyed homes and critical infrastructure facility. Ultimately, what you get is the Ukrainian expats, the bright expats are actually leaving Ukraine and they are migrating into other countries. The loss of human capital would be immense, apart from infrastructure facilities getting destroyed. And this has to end somewhere. And America needs to realize that already they have carried out 13,000 aerial bombings on Iran. They have effectively crippled the Iranian infrastructure as well. And ultimately, the Middle East is burning. If you see Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Qatar, Jordan, all of them have suffered infrastructure loss. They are unable to get oil revenue as well. They have lost the non-oil revenue of tourist and cross-border investments. Everything needs to stop. This mindless war is actually a curse on the humanity.
Mr.
And
Agarwal,
inflation is spiraling across the world.
Yes, no, definitely. And you mentioned something in relation to Pakistan. Obviously, they're stepping in as mediators, but you also made a claim that they also have a number of other military missiles and things like that. I don't have a Pakistani reporter here to kind of claim those, to stand on that, so I'm just going to have to put that on pause there because we need to get a very balanced side in relation to that. But I want to bring you to another key element, and that is the Hungary elections, only because we know that there's now a new leader. Peter Magyar has now been elected as the Hungary Prime Minister there, which we know that Viktor Orban was very much there for 16 years, was very close to Putin, and was able to stop a number of things going ahead because of what the EU wanted to give to Ukraine for funding and assistance. Will that change now that there is a new leader in Hungary? Will that help Ukraine to push forward extra funding so that they could actually win the war against Russia?
See, recently, I believe that the Russian defense minister has threatened that he would be continuing bombing on European infrastructure, the European facilities which make drones and other equipments, and they are being supplied to Ukraine. So Russia has already taken in account of a possible EU flare-up against it, and they are ready to go for a further strikes on other EU members, and now they might increase the scope of the war as well, because ultimately these projectiles are crippling the Russian critical infrastructure, like their ports, their oil facilities, storage facilities. It's hurting the Russian revenue. So this might be the case. Right now, the Russian defense minister has stated, and this is a very wide concern for a possible escalation in the near future.
But if things do escalate, as you just mentioned there, and it goes beyond Ukraine, that would include the EU having to step in, or even NATO member countries having to step in. Is this what Russia wants, a wider regional war spreading to other parts of the EU? They won't be able to defend themselves or even protect themselves if that is the case. What are your thoughts about that?
The basic thing is, if there is no peace accord in the Middle East, Russia might open another front of war against the European allies who are supporting Ukraine. And also one more thing, Russia will never like UK and other countries to start drilling for oil, because the thing is, ultimately the revenue of Russia is dependent on oil revenues. If UK start drilling oil and gas, it will effectively cripple the Russian economy as well, and European dependence on Russian crude. This is very much important. Basically, the conflicts are engineered today for geoeconomics for their own economic interest. I believe that once this peace talks fail, if Middle East peace talks fail, Russia is getting ready for a wider escalation. And also there are potential cracks in NATO as well. Recently in the Middle East war, many countries like France, Italy, Spain, Switzerland never allowed the American planes to use their airspace. In fact, the Spanish president, Pedro Sanchez, went to China, and he is now getting closer to the China as well. So a lot of things are happening geopolitically. I believe that this might result in a wider conflict, and how NATO has to get together. Lot of confusion, chaos around the world. And in this meantime, if anything happens in the South China Sea, we might see a worldwide conflict. I will not say that world war, but it will be a localized conflict, multiple localized conflict across the world.
Well, we'll definitely have to watch this space and see exactly how things unfold throughout the coming weeks and months. But thank you, Mr. Agarwal, for your insights there.
Thank you very much.
Now we turn to another news story in relation to Pope Leo XIV, who is continuing his Africa tour with a strong message of peace. He arrived in the mineral-rich country of Cameroon and was greeted by tens of thousands who lined the streets to welcome his visit, while also delivering a speech on combating corruption. Let's take a look at that.
Pope Leo XIV has arrived in Cameroon, pressing ahead with a message of peace and justice despite sharp criticism from Donald Trump. Trump has repeatedly criticised the Pope during his Africa tour over his views on global conflicts and social issues. In response, the pontiff did not name him directly, but stressed the need for dialogue, saying people can live together in peace despite their differences. Speaking in the capital Yaoundé, he urged leaders to take a bold leap forward and warned that corruption undermines trust in authority. Addressing Paul Biya, the president of Cameroon, he said the chains of corruption must be broken for justice to prevail.
Hearts must be set free from an idolatrous thirst for profit. True profit comes from integral human development. That is, the balanced growth of all the aspects that make life on this earth a blessing.
He also called for an end to violence in Cameroon's English-speaking regions, where a separatist conflict has claimed thousands of lives. During his three-day visit, he is expected to travel to Bamenda for a peace meeting, with armed groups announcing a temporary pause in fighting. Crowds gathered in Yaoundé to welcome the Pope, singing and dancing in scenes reflecting hope for change and unity. The Cameroon leg is part of a broader 10-day Africa tour that includes Angola and Equatorial Guinea. A major mass is expected in Douala, where large crowds are anticipated. Before arriving in Cameroon, Pope Leo visited Algeria, where he promoted interfaith dialogue and peaceful coexistence. In Annaba, he highlighted the teachings of St. Augustine of Hippo, urging unity across religions. Throughout the trip, the Pope has maintained a consistent message. Peace, respect and justice must prevail over division, regardless of political pressure.
Protests have erupted in Venezuela, with demonstrators demanding justice for detainees and better living conditions. Relatives of political prisoners accuse authorities of abuse and inhumane conditions at a maximum security prison. In a separate rally near the Supreme Court, public workers and retirees call for higher wages and long-delayed pension reforms, saying incomes no longer cover basic needs and low pay is driving migration. This comes after acting President Delcy Rodriguez said her government will make a responsible increase to workers' income on the 1st of May, but many say they want it now. You're watching Daybreak on A News. We're going to take a short break. Don't go anywhere.
are in Somalia, a place often used through the illusion of constant danger.
Somalia is already facing security threats from groups like Al-Shabaab.
Currently, Somalia has 3.4 million people internally displaced.
Mr. President, I want you to know that I'm signing now Israel's official recognition of Somaliland.
We are expecting all member states of the United Nations to recognize Somaliland.
We strongly rejected Prime Minister Netanyahu's illegal aggression in recognizing part of Somalia.
A conflict will last. People make so much money on it.
This country sits at the crossroads between instability and order, isolation and connection, risks and responsibility.
Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak with me, Nadia Jani. Now we head over to what's happening in Europe. And new efforts to tackle anti-Semitism across Europe, France and Italy are sparking growing concerns over free speech and political dissent as lawmakers move to define and criminalise what they describe as modern forms of anti-Semitism. Our correspondent Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where new efforts to combat anti-Semitism in France and Italy trigger a growing backlash over free speech and political dissent. Lawmakers in both countries are advancing legislation aimed at defining and criminalizing what they call modern forms of anti-Semitism. This follows a sharp rise in anti-Jewish incidents since the 2023 Hamas attack and the war in Gaza. In France, a proposed law would broaden existing rules to penalize both implicit support for terrorism and calls for Israel's destruction. In Italy, lawmakers are moving to go even further, potentially becoming the first country to enshrine the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism into law, a definition that includes some forms of criticism of Israel. Supporters argue the measures are necessary to respond to what they call a new wave of anti-Semitism, with incidents rising sharply across Europe in recent years. But critics, including human rights groups, academics, and UN officials, warn the laws risk blurring the line between hate speech and legitimate political expression, particularly when it comes to criticism of Israeli government policies. Irene Khan, UN Special Rapporteur on Free Speech, says the proposals could confuse what is permitted speech with what is prohibited, raising concerns that pro-Palestinian activism and public debate could be curtailed. In France, opposition is already mounting, with hundreds of thousands signing a petition against the bill, arguing it could conflate criticism of Israel with hostility toward Jewish communities. Today, debate on the French bill is scheduled to begin, while in Rome, the bill is expected to begin its passage through the lower house after being approved by a large majority in the upper house last month. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Now to the US, and Los Angeles County Museum of Art is opening a new chapter, unveiling a landmark gallery space decades in the making. It highlights one of the most significant changes in its history. Here's more.
The Los Angeles County Museum of Art has unveiled its new David Geffen galleries, marking one of the most significant transformations in the museum's history. The new space will house LACME's permanent collection, with more than 110,000 square feet of exhibition space set within a 3.5-acre public park featuring outdoor artworks. The galleries are scheduled to open to the public on April 19th. Museum Director Michael Govan described the project as the result of 2 decades of planning aimed at redefining how art is experienced.
Yes, it's showtime at LACMA. We're in the new David Geffen galleries, which have been decades in the making. We've built many other buildings, but this is the culmination of 20 years of work and thinking about what museums can be.
Govan said the new facility is expected to attract major art donations.
Yeah, it's really true that people spend their life collecting art, want their art to go to a place where it will be well cared for, but also a beautiful place. And frankly, the facilities we had previously weren't up to the task. And I met with many people who just weren't going to gift their collections. Remember, almost everything here is a gift from someone. And they weren't going to gift their collections unless there was a facility worthy of their art. So now we have a facility worthy of their art, and whether it's the Van Gogh or Monet or many other artworks that have been gifted here because of the beauty of this new museum.
Officials say the galleries are also designed to make art more accessible, particularly for younger audiences. The opening marks a major milestone for the museum as it seeks to expand its role as a cultural hub in Los Angeles.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'll be back tomorrow to take you through the rest of the morning's headlines, but make sure you stay tuned to A News as we'll have a number of updates on those stories throughout the day. Take care and have a good one.